Hi, I'm Ross Jacobs. Today's topic is quite difficult to talk about because the more I delve into it, the more complex it gets and the harder it is to understand. It's about the difference between driving a horse and directing a horse when we use pressure. It's something that people really get confused about. I talk a lot about this in my clinics, but it's so important that I'm going to try and present it today in a way that's as clear and as basic as I can. But understand this, that as you think about this topic more and more, you realize it's a lot more complex than first thought. Now, the reason it's important that we talk about the difference between driving a horse and directing a horse is that the same difference that exists between those two is the difference between our relationship where our horse works for us like an employee and our horse works with us like a partner. Most of us, I know, want our horses to be partners. We may be the 51% senior partner, but we still want them to have a say. We want them to feel okay and they have an invested interest in getting along with us. The trouble is most training doesn't really take this into account because most training entails teaching a horse to be obedient. And so driving is the predominant way we do this. But if we want to get along with our horses, if we wanted to have some sort of good relationship, then it's important that we transform our driving pressure into a directing pressure. So I guess first I should explain the difference. And this is my definition. It may not be yours, but it's how I define them. And as you can guess, it's really about a horse's thought. So the way I talk about driving is when the pressure causes a horse's thought and his feet to go in different directions. That's really important you understand that. When we apply a driving pressure, we are asking a horse, his feet to go one way, but his thought is going another way. And in that regard, what's really happening is that a horse is escaping from pressure. So, for example, if we swing the tail end of a rope at a horse that we have on the end of the line, his thought will go to that rope, swinging. He says, oh my goodness, that's pressure. I don't like that. I need to get away from it. So they go the opposite direction. But their thought was the rope swinging at them, the pressure driving them away. So it's an escape mechanism that we're teaching them when we apply driving pressure. Directing pressure is different. Directing is trying to establish that a horse's thought and his feet go in the same direction. So we might ask, again, if we look at a horse on the end of a rope, we might ask him to think over to his left and then to take his feet to his left. It's asking his thought and his feet to go the same way. So it's actually following the pressure rather than fleeing the pressure. And as you can imagine, the difference in feel that puts in a horse is quite significant and how a horse feels about working with us. If we're always driving, we're always teaching them to escape. If we are directing them, we're teaching them to go with. And that's a huge difference in how a horse works with us. Now I'm going to actually try and show you, demonstrate some of these principles in action using one of our horses. And we're only going to do a little bit because, as I say, the more you get involved in this, the more technical and complicated it gets. And I want to keep this simple. And maybe in a later video, we can delve into it a little more detail and look at some of the intricacies that this involves. Okay, so we'll get started now. This is Guy. He's an Arab gelding, 20 plus years old, has had very little work, almost no work in the last several years. Very sensitive horse, gets worried about everything. Anyway, so what I want to start off with is just demonstrating the difference between my actions when I drive versus when I direct. And you may see a difference in the way Guy responds as well. So as I said earlier, most of us spend our training time driving horses. So an example of this might be if I ask Guy to go out on a circle out to his right, that I would take the rope and I start swinging. And if you notice, he looked out strongly through his left eye at the rope, but moved to the right. If you compare that, it's all right, little guy. If you compare that with me asking him to think out to his left, now take his feet out to his left. And he followed the feel of that rope. So instead of trying to escape the rope, like he did just a moment ago, he actually followed the feel of it. And that's the fundamental difference. And I hope you could see there was quite a difference in the way Guy felt about when I drove him versus when I directed him. He felt a lot more comfortable, and it put a lot less emotional strain on our relationship when I directed him. So I want you to see that. Now, it wouldn't matter what it is. If I used the swinging of the rope, if I slapped my leg, if I picked up a flag, if I used a whip, even using my voice, anything that causes a horse to want to escape from the pressure, so that his thought is on that thing that's causing the pressure and his feet are trying to get away from it, that is driving. And you want to avoid that as much as possible. But having said that, let me just emphasize that a lot of the time, in order for us to get to the point where we can start directing a horse's thought and his feet flow with that, in the process of getting there, we end up having to drive. Because a lot of the time, horse doesn't know how to work with pressure. So they don't know what to do. So you ask them to go out on a circle like that, and you get him to think out there. Now, if he was another horse, he may not know what to do with his feet. And so even if I got him, just step over there, sweetie. Even if I got him to look out to his right there, and he didn't know what to do then, I may have to drive him in order to establish the idea, the connection, to follow the feel of that rope. So I'm not criticizing people who drive. I'm not saying you should never drive your horse. I do it all the time. But I do it only with the intention that pretty soon I can ask Guy to follow a feel. Just wait, he's leaving because his thought's over there. So I'm interrupting that. I need him to think out to his left, to his right a bit more, a little more, and now he can move his feet. So I will use driving, but only with the intention of getting him to the point where I no longer have to drive, that our communication works by me trying to direct his thought here and direct his thought there, and his feet will go where the flow of that pressure is directing. That's so important. If you never try to get a horse to be directable, to direct him, then you're always going to have a love-hate relationship with your horse. There's always going to be some level of worry in him and some level of evasion in him. So how do you make sure that you can move away from always driving a horse? There's a couple of things to remember. One is that every time you ask a horse to do something, you always start by trying to direct his thought. Even if you know he can't pay attention to it or he doesn't understand it, you must present it every time as the first polite ask. If you don't present it, he can never learn it. So you first always make sure you present it first. Then if that doesn't get through, doesn't get a change, then you back it up with driving. But next time, you start again. Present the first polite, can you think over there? Can your thoughts go where, can your feet go where that thought is? Every time, even if you're sure it means nothing to him, still present it. The second thing that's important is that if you have to resort to driving him, you must get a change of thought. It must mean something to him that when you put some pressure on him, it tells him to change what he's thinking. And if you don't do that, you're always going to end up having to drive him as well. So you must first present the idea that you're directing him. And second, if you do need to drive him, you must get a change of thought, not just move his feet. But if you ask him to go out to the right, if you ask him to go forward, if you ask him to go back, he actually changes that idea from pushing or leaning against you or resisting that idea to going with it. You ask him to go back, he says, right, I'll go back. And you don't stop asking till he thinks back. You ask him to go out to the right and he leans on the left. You keep asking until he thinks out to the right. You must always get a change of thought. And without that, he's learned nothing. So if you can present the idea that you can direct him first, and if you have to drive him, that you get a change of thought before you finish driving, then pretty soon you'll be able to avoid driving him, and directing will be the name of the game. Well, that's it for driving versus directing. I hope it's given you a lot to think about. I've only shown you the very basic example of what it means to drive or what it is to direct, and it gets a lot more complicated the more you delve into this. Think about if your horse is dragging on the end of the lead rope and you decide to firm up with the rope. Are you driving or are you directing? What about when you're riding along and your horse's feet get a little more sluggish, so you decide to get a little more active in your seat? Are you driving or are you directing? Positive reinforcement using clicker training. Are you driving or are you directing? The answer to those questions are not nearly as simple as it might first seem. If you think of it in terms of what a horse is thinking and what he's actually doing, you'll find that sometimes you'll be leading your horse and you firm up on the rope and you're directing. Other times you'll be actually driving. Same thing with riding and using your seat. Sometimes you'll be driving, sometimes you'll be directing. And likewise with using clicker training or other forms of positive reinforcement. Sometimes it's actually driving a horse and sometimes it's directing them. And it's important to know the distinction. It's not always obvious. People often make the mistake and look at the amount of pressure being used, and they use that as the watermark for whether it's driving or directing. As if the more pressure you use, you must be driving, and the less pressure you use, you must be directing. Even though that's often true, it's not always true. So that's why I urge you to think about what a horse is thinking versus what he's doing. Is he trying to escape the pressure or is he trying to go with it? That's the thing you should be considering when watching somebody working a horse or even applying these thoughts to your own work. So I urge you to think about this a lot. Maybe it'll give you some sleepless nights, and I think then my job will have been well done. Because it's so important, if you want to get along with your horse as best you can, it's so important you understand this concept. Well, thanks for watching. Good night, Alice, wherever you are.